What if the hospitals built to heal were never meant to cure? What if behind their towering red brick walls, the silence of medicine concealed something darker, rooms filled not with recovery, but with neglect, abuse, and even experiments too secret to admit? For over a century, America's state hospitals stood as monuments to progress. Politicians praised them as sanctuaries. Families entrusted their loved ones, believing they would receive protection, education, and care. But history tells another story. Patients lived tied to beds, malnourished, abandoned in overcrowded wards. Children were used as test subjects for CIA mind control experiments, and the institutions, rather than protecting the vulnerable, perfected the art of hiding them away. Tonight, we open the files they tried to bury. We walk through corridors, once filled with cries that never left the walls. We revisit scandals that should have ended the system, but didn't. And we confront the ruins that remain, silent witnesses to lives lost in the name of order, secrecy, and convenience. Before we begin, welcome to Gothic Ledger. Write down in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are now. We want to know how far our reach travels and whose night, morning, or midnight we are sharing this story with. And while you are here, remember to subscribe and like this video. Your support keeps these forgotten histories alive. What follows is not fiction. These are the records, the testimonies, and the ruins that endure. The story of America's state hospitals is not only about what happened within them, it is about how long the world chose to look away. They rose like monuments across the American landscape, vast red brick citadels surrounded by fields, rivers, and carefully manicured lawns. To the public eye of the 19th and early 20th century, these state hospitals represented progress, a noble gesture of civilization reaching toward its most vulnerable members. Reformers and politicians cut ribbons in front of looming entrance halls, promising an era when science, architecture, and compassion would work in concert to heal minds thought broken beyond repair. The architecture itself spoke of ambition. Wide corridors, high ceilings, and radiant windows were not merely aesthetic choices, but physical expressions of a philosophy that the environment could shape and restore the human psyche. The Kirkbride plan, adopted in many such institutions, dictated long, staggered wings so that patients might wake to sunlight and fresh air, as if geometry and landscape themselves could undo despair. In pamphlets and speeches, these buildings were called temples of healing. Newspapers carried photographs of their grounds, green lawns stretching outward, cloisters of trees providing shaded walks, and porches where patients would, in theory, gather to recover strength. But beneath the optimism lay a foreboding truth. These hospitals were not designed as open sanctuaries, but as controlled spaces, carefully walled and watched. Their grandeur was also their disguise. The high iron gates, the long rows of barred windows, and the endless repetition of brick and stone made clear that the patients admitted were meant to remain unseen. What the public celebrated as benevolence also marked a new era of separation, where those deemed unfit for society would be removed from it entirely. The ceremonies of opening often blurred the line between promise and concealment. Governors and reformers delivered speeches about humane care, yet patients entered through back doors, processed quietly into locked wards, while the front steps bore garlands and speeches. The public was shown gardens, not wards, dining halls, not cells. Even in their first days, these institutions relied on spectacle to assure society of their virtue, while the truth remained hidden within. The idea of healing itself carried an implicit contradiction. These asylums promised treatment, but their scale suggested containment. By the early 20th century, many states boasted campuses so large they resembled small cities. Power plants, farms, laundries, and cemeteries all built into the grounds. In brochures, this self-sufficiency was described as efficiency. In reality, it made the hospitals nearly sovereign, sealed off from oversight, and dependent only on the rhythm of their own administrators. The legacy of these openings lingers in archival photographs. Wide shots of imposing facades, lines of officials in hats and coats, the names of the institutions carved into granite above the doors. At the time, they inspired pride, but with distance, the images reveal a more unsettling truth. These temples were built as much to contain as to cure, as much to erase from sight as to restore. The hospitals began as monuments of hope. Yet the very walls that promised protection would in time become barriers of silence. The optimism of dedication ceremonies did not last. Within a generation of their construction, America's state hospitals were already collapsing under the weight of their own ambition. What had been promised as sanctuaries of recovery became warehouses of human suffering. The decline was not sudden but gradual, a steady erosion marked by empty budgets, swelling patient registers, and staff whose numbers never matched the need. Overcrowding was the first betrayal. Designed for a few hundred residents, many institutions soon held thousands. Wards intended for light, air, and therapeutic order were converted into crammed dormitories. Beds lined the corridors, sometimes placed so close that attendants could barely walk between them. When beds ran out, patients slept on straw pallets, on benches, or directly on the floor. Reports of patients stacked 2 and 3 to a bed emerged as early as the 1890s, yet officials dismissed them as exaggerations. Underfunding shaped every detail of daily life. Legislatures, eager to celebrate the idea of asylums, resisted paying their actual costs. Food was purchased in bulk and stretched thin, leaving many residents malnourished. Buildings fell into disrepair, plaster crumbled from ceilings, roofs leaked, and broken windows were patched with cardboard. Heating systems failed in winter, leaving patients shivering in wards where frost gathered on the inside of the glass. The therapeutic architecture designed with such hope became skeletal shells of their original form. Staffing, too, proved inadequate from the beginning. Where reformers had promised attentive care, the reality was overworked attendants, many with little or no training, responsible for dozens of patients at once. Some worked double shifts for meagre pay, often resorting to physical restraint when patients wore thin. Neglect, once unthinkable, became normalized through exhaustion and necessity. The lack of physicians meant that many residents never saw a doctor after their initial admission. Illness spread unchecked, with tuberculosis, influenza, and untreated infections silently claiming lives inside the walls. Early reports of abuse filtered outward, but they were easily silenced. Visiting committees noted overcrowded conditions and underfed patients, but their observations were buried in annual reports, filed and forgotten. Families who raised concerns were reassured that such conditions were temporary. Whistleblowers were discredited, their accounts dismissed as bitter exaggerations. Behind closed doors, the reality remained invisible to a public that still believed in the promise of temples of healing. The gulf between promise and reality widened with each passing year. Institutions that once symbolized modern progress now functioned as holding facilities, their primary task no longer healing but containment. The architecture that once dazzled with symmetry and light became the backdrop for decay. Paintings of bright grounds and open-air porches were still used in pamphlets, while inside the wards, patients sat in silence, rocking, waiting, and forgotten. By the early 20th century, the pattern was already set. What had begun as a noble experiment in humane care had calcified into a system of neglect, funded too little, scrutinized too rarely, and shielded by walls both literal and institutional. The hidden reality of the state hospital was not hope fulfilled but hope abandoned. From their earliest years, state hospitals learned that survival depended not on treatment, but on concealment. The same walls that separated patients from the public also insulated administrators from scrutiny. Silence became policy, and secrecy its most reliable instrument. Patient letters rarely reached the outside world unaltered. Written pleas for release or descriptions of hunger and mistreatment were intercepted by staff and filed away, sometimes marked with notations like delusional or unreliable. In many institutions, correspondence required approval before leaving the grounds. Words that revealed too much were cut out, or the letter withheld entirely. Families, receiving only carefully filtered notes, assumed their loved ones were improving, unaware that despair had been stripped from the page. When inspections were scheduled, hospitals transformed overnight. Wards were scrubbed, patients dressed in clean clothing, and dining halls staged with fresh meals that would vanish once officials departed. The most disturbed residents were hidden from view, locked in basement cells or sent outdoors on long walks until the inspection ended. Visitors saw orderly dormitories and quiet, compliant patients. They did not see the shackles, the bare mattresses, or the smell of untreated sores lingering in unvisited wings. Administrators perfected the art of reassurance. Families who questioned conditions were told that discipline was therapeutic, that restraints were necessary, that silence meant recovery. Photographs circulated in pamphlets showed bright courtyards and airy porches, even as most patients spent their days in locked rooms with barred windows. Annual reports described advancements and improvements in patient care, though the very same documents quietly recorded deaths from preventable disease, suicide, or neglect in statistics few ever examined. Once almost extended to the archives themselves. Incident reports, when they existed, were filed in ways that obscured patterns. Investigations into abuse were conducted by the very staff accused, their findings predictably exonerating. Families who pressed too hard were discouraged from visiting, told that interference would hinder recovery. In this way, isolation deepened, not only for the patients, but for the truth itself. Even whistleblowers found their words smothered. Attendants who attempted to report mistreatment were dismissed as disgruntled. Journalists were denied access, their requests for entry delayed until stories lost momentum. And when the rare exposé did break through, administrators framed it as an aberration, one unfortunate institution among hundreds supposedly functioning as intended. The public, trusting in authority and reassured by official statements, rarely pressed further. Hospitals relied on society's willingness not to know, its preference for believing that care was being delivered just out of sight. Thus, secrecy did not merely hide abuse, it sustained it. What endured behind the facades of red brick and manicured grounds was not progress but silence. A silence maintained by censored letters, staged inspections, and the burial of records that might have spoken otherwise. Within that silence, neglect grew unchecked, and suffering became ordinary. What the public saw was order. What the walls held was everything else. By the mid-20th century, Philadelphia's Byberry State Hospital had already become a whispered name among social workers and investigators. Patients spoke of hunger, filth, and violence, but their words rarely left the wards. In 1948, that silence was broken, not by administrators, but by a photographer's lens. The exposé that followed appeared in Life magazine, and the images it carried burned themselves into the national consciousness. Naked men, emaciated and hollow-eyed, stood herded together in barren rooms where the floors were slick with urine and feces. Others crouched against walls, staring blankly into space, their bodies wasting away in silence. Mattresses were scarce, clothing absent, and attendants nowhere in sight. The photographs, stark in their detail, drew an unavoidable comparison. This was not the promise of treatment, but a scene disturbingly close to what the world had only recently witnessed in liberated concentration camps. The language of the reports reflected the shock. Inspectors described Byberry as dehumanized, a place where patients existed rather than lived. Survivors of the Second World War, reading the exposé, could not ignore the parallel between the nation that had fought to end Nazi atrocities abroad and the institutions now revealed at home. The outrage was immediate, the images too raw to deny. Yet even in the wake of public condemnation, the structure of concealment endured. Officials promised swift reform, but resources were withheld and administrators deflected blame. Byberry's conditions were framed as exceptional, an isolated failure rather than the logical result of systemic neglect. Patients continued to languish behind the same walls, their suffering now momentarily acknowledged but still unaddressed. The comparison to Nazi camps was not a flourish of journalism, but an unavoidable fact of record. Investigators note the skeletal figures, unwashed bodies crawling with lice, and the stench of untreated wounds. Some patients, unable to stand, crawled across the filth-covered floors. In the absence of sufficient staff, the stronger patients were left to control the weaker, establishing hierarchies of cruelty that compounded the neglect. Death, when it came, was recorded as little more than a number in an annual report. The photographs became evidence, but not a verdict. Byberry remained open for more than 40 years after the exposé, its wards still filled with the same human shadows. The scandal did not dismantle the system. It merely illuminated it for a moment, before the public's attention shifted elsewhere. Archival records from the period reveal the persistence of denial. Legislators debated budgets rather than reforms. Administrators insisted that the worst images were staged or exaggerated. Meanwhile, patients continued to die in silence, their conditions momentarily visible in print, but invisible in practice. Byberry was supposed to be a hospital. The exposé revealed instead an American bedlam, a place where suffering was not the consequence of illness alone, but of deliberate neglect. The walls remained standing long after the photographs faded from headlines, a testament to how much could be seen and still ignored. The 1948 exposé of Byberry filled newspapers with images so disturbing that they could not be dismissed as rumor. For a brief season, outrage spread through living rooms and legislative chambers. Politicians vowed reform, civic leaders demanded accountability, editorials declared that such inhumanity could not stand in a nation that called itself modern and civilized. Yet when the noise subsided, the walls of Byberry still stood, and within them, little changed. Administrators offered explanations more than solutions. They pointed to overcrowding, insufficient budgets, and the supposed unpredictability of patients. They argued that the images in Life magazine had captured only the worst corners of the hospital, exaggerating a reality that was otherwise tolerable. Legislators echoed these defenses, promising funds that never arrived, forming committees that quietly dissolved, assuring the public that improvements were underway, while day-to-day life inside remained the same. The politics of denial carried its own efficiency. Outrage burned hot but briefly. Investigations were delayed, their findings buried in bureaucratic language that spoke of recommendations rather than requirements. Inspectors returned to see staged order, patients scrubbed and dressed and left convinced or complicit. Meanwhile, the wards filled again with silence, with hunger, with the same neglect that had been captured on film. The irony was striking. Byberry had been nationally shamed, its name synonymous with cruelty, yet it endured another 4 decades. Patients continued to sleep on floors, to wither from untreated illness, to endure lives of monotony punctuated by bursts of violence. The photographs had revealed the truth, but reform required more than exposure. It required sustained attention, and that was precisely what the system was designed to outlast. Archival correspondence between state officials shows the pattern. Letters acknowledged the unfortunate situation, praised the dedication of staff under difficult circumstances, and urged patience from families and reformers alike. Administrators promised to reduce overcrowding, but admissions never slowed. They pledged to increase staffing, but wages remained too low to attract trained professionals. Even the most basic recommendations, such as improving sanitation or ensuring adequate food, were deferred for future appropriations. For the patients, the gap between exposure and reform meant only continuity. The same corridors, the same filth, the same silence stretched on long after public attention moved elsewhere. The promise of reform had been given, and that was enough for most observers. The reality, that reform was never delivered, was left to rot behind locked doors. The scandal that should have dismantled the system instead became absorbed into it. Byberry's conditions were not corrected, only normalized, their horror dulled by repetition and bureaucratic endurance. The photographs remained as evidence, but they were treated as artifacts of a past already condemned, even as the present carried on unchanged. Byberry endured because outrage alone could not alter a structure built to conceal. Reform requires vigilance. Neglect requires only silence. And silence was the one resource the asylum system never lacked. Byberry's scandal should have ended an era. The photographs of naked, emaciated men huddled in filth were clear enough that reform seemed inevitable. Instead, the shock slowly dissolved into silence, and what had been revealed as intolerable became absorbed into the fabric of American institutional life. Byberry did not stand alone. It merely reflected conditions long familiar in other state hospitals. In time, it became less an exception than a precedent. Administrators in other states learned a quiet lesson. Outrage could be endured. An expose might erupt, inspections might be ordered, but the storm would pass. What remained was the same system of underfunding, overcrowding, and neglect, now carried on with the reassurance that it could survive public exposure. The photographs had shown the depths of cruelty, yet they were treated as a singular scandal rather than evidence of a pattern. Across the country, institutions mirrored the same conditions. At Penhurst in Pennsylvania, at Willowbrook in New York, at countless hospitals in the Midwest and South, wards overflowed with residents strapped to beds or left idle in barren day rooms. Food was inadequate, clothing scarce, sanitation poor. But administrators continued to speak of progress and treatment, invoking the language of reform, even as practices remained unchanged. Annual reports illustrate the contradiction. Hospitals recorded high patient numbers as proof of their necessity, while also noting deaths from preventable illnesses, injuries from restraint, and persistent overcrowding. These reports, couched in technical language, concealed the scale of suffering while affirming the importance of the institutions themselves. Legislators, confronted with evidence of abuse, reassured the public with promises of incremental improvement, always framed as pending future funding. The result was a cycle of exposure and denial, where cruelty became normalized through bureaucratic endurance. For the patients, normalization meant permanence. The hunger, the filth, the neglect did not vanish after Byberry's scandal. They continued, unremarked, because the system had learned to outlast scrutiny. Families who raised concerns were told their loved ones were receiving the best possible care under difficult circumstances. Newspapers, once filled with shocking images, moved on to other crises. The public, having seen too much, chose not to look again. The irony is that Byberry's scandal strengthened the very structure it revealed. By absorbing the worst into the narrative of the isolated failure, other institutions found cover, so long as their abuses did not rise to the spectacle of Byberry's photographs. They could persist unchallenged. The lesson was not reform, but survival through concealment. What had been called America's Bedlam did not collapse the asylum system. It entrenched it, teaching administrators that horror could be endured so long as it was hidden in plain sight. Byberry revealed the system's truth, and the system responded not with change, but with normalization. Thus, neglect became routine, cruelty became ordinary, and horror itself became institutionalized, quietly accepted as the cost of doing nothing. Penhurst State School and Hospital opened in 1908 as a refuge for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Its founding charter spoke of protection, training, and compassion. Yet within a few decades, the institution became synonymous not with care, but with cruelty. Behind its gates, children who had been entrusted to the state were subjected to conditions that stripped them of dignity, identity, and even the most basic recognition of their humanity. Archival reports describe wards filled with children strapped to beds or left immobile in crude restraints. Limbs were bound not for medical necessity, but for convenience, ensuring that overworked attendants could manage dozens at once. Many children lay for hours in soiled bedding, unattended except for occasional feedings. Staff shortages were cited in annual reports, yet the response was not to increase care, but to further restrict movement, treating the young residents less as patients than as burdens to be contained. Starvation haunted the institution. Meals were meager, often consisting of watery stews or stale bread. Malnourishment became a recurring diagnosis, though it was framed as an inevitability of disability rather than a consequence of neglect. Some children were recorded as failure to thrive, a bureaucratic phrase that concealed the reality of empty stomachs and wasted frames. In photographs preserved in court exhibits decades later, their faces appear gaunt, their eyes distant, as if life itself had been withdrawn piece by piece. Physical abuse was equally pervasive. Witness testimony, later preserved in lawsuits, recalled attendants striking children for crying, forcing them into silence through blows or threats. Those who resisted were isolated in barren rooms, their punishment framed as discipline. In the absence of oversight, cruelty became routine, passed from one shift of and dance to the next. The sorrow of Penhurst lies in its broken promise. Families entrusted children to the institution believing they would receive training, education, and the chance to live with dignity. Instead, the institution functioned as a warehouse, locking away those society wished not to see. Some children never received instruction, never touched a book, never learned a word beyond what they carried when they entered. For them, childhood ended not in growth, but in confinement. Archival inspection notes, when read today, carry a chilling flatness. Patient restrained, patient non-compliant, patient underweight. These phrases repeat across decades, detached phrases describing lives spent in restraint, hunger, and neglect. Each line reduces a child to a problem to be managed rather than a life to be nurtured. Penhurst endured for generations, its abuses hidden behind walls and paperwork. The children who passed through its gates were promised protection, but what they received was silence and erasure. They were bound, beaten, starved, and forgotten, not because of what they had done, but because society chose to look away. What remains now are records, testimonies, and the memory of children who lived in shadow, stripped of the safety and care that had been promised. Penhurst was not an aberration. It was the logical continuation of a system that found it easier to bind children to beds than to honor their humanity. In 1968, Penhurst's silence was broken, not by administrators, not by politicians, but by the unblinking lens of a television camera. CBS News broadcast an investigative report titled "Suffer the Little Children," and for the first time, millions of Americans saw what had been hidden behind institutional walls. The program opened with images difficult to reconcile with the word school. Children with vacant stares sat strapped to benches, their limbs bound to prevent movement. Others lay on the floor, rocking against cold tile walls, their cries unanswered. The narration described not isolated incidents, but daily conditions, overcrowded wards, underfed children, and abuse so routine it had become the institution's language. The footage was stark. Young faces bore bruises, thin bodies struggled to lift spoons that had not been guided to their mouths. In one scene, an attendant moved through a ward, not to teach or comfort, but to silence noise with a gesture of threat. The camera did not sensationalize, it simply recorded, and the images spoke for themselves. The result was more devastating than any report or testimony. The public reaction was immediate. Viewers who had accepted assurances of progress now saw undeniable evidence of cruelty. Letters poured into state offices demanding accountability. Editorials declared Pennhurst an indictment of the entire asylum system. For families who had long suspected neglect but lacked proof, the documentary confirmed their fears. For others, it shattered the belief that institutions were humane refugees. The legal consequences followed swiftly. Suffer the Little Children became evidence in courtrooms, cited in lawsuits that argued the state had violated the most basic rights of its wards. Attorneys representing families and advocacy groups invoked the footage as proof of systemic abuse, not aberration. Judges could no longer discern misaccounts as exaggerated when confronted with moving images broadcast to the entire nation. Administrators responded with familiar defenses: overcrowding, underfunding, the difficulty of managing difficult patients. But the images had stripped these excuses of credibility. What had once been abstract, the idea of abuse, the suggestion of neglect, was now concrete, visible, undeniable. Silence, the system's most reliable shield, had been broken by a camera crew willing to show what society had chosen not to see. The documentary's title itself carried accusation. Suffer the Little Children did not frame Pennhurst as a flawed institution, but as a place where children suffered by design, through neglect, institutionalized as policy. It reframed the question from whether abuse existed to why it had been tolerated for so long. Pennhurst did not close immediately, but the broadcast marked a turning point. What had been ignored could no longer be denied. The camera, more than inspections or reports, forced a nation to confront the reality of its state schools. In the archival record, the CBS expose remains a dividing line. Before 1968, Pennhurst's cruelty lived in shadows and whispers. Afterward, it lived in film, preserved as evidence, impossible to erase. For the children who had suffered unseen, the camera's gaze came too late. For the nation, it was the first time the walls could no longer hide what lay within. In 1972, the walls of yet another institution were breached, not by reformers or inspectors, but by a journalist carrying a camera. Willowbrook State School on Staten Island had long been rumored to house children in conditions of degradation. Parents whispered of overcrowded wards, of children left unattended, of filth allowed to accumulate unchecked. But until television reporter Geraldo Rivera walked through its doors with a hidden camera, the reality remained deniable. The footage was stark, its images carried into American living rooms during evening broadcasts. Children, many unclothed, sat slumped on the floor of barren rooms. Others wandered aimlessly through corridors smeared with waste, their movements repetitive, their eyes vacant. Beds were scarce, hygiene non-existent. Some children were seen lying in their own excrement, their thin bodies unattended, as staff moved listlessly through overcrowded wards. Rivera's narration described the institution as a snake pit, and the phrase struck with precision. Willowbrook had been built for 4,000 residents, yet by the early 1970s it held more than 6,000. The pressure of numbers did not explain the depth of neglect, but it gave administrators their excuse. For years, the state had justified conditions as the product of limited resources, as if starvation and filth were inevitable byproducts of disability. The broadcast shattered such defenses. No statistic could erase the sight of children rocking in silence on dirty floors, of young faces blank with hunger and neglect. The images pierced through decades of rationalization, revealing not the exception, but the rule of institutional care. Public reaction was immediate and furious. Families who had entrusted their children to Willowbrook demanded accountability. Advocacy groups seized the footage as evidence of systemic failure, using it to file lawsuits that challenge not only Willowbrook, but the very legality of warehousing the disabled. Newspapers reprinted stills from the broadcast, editorial boards demanded reform, and state officials scrambled to contain the damage. Yet Willowbrook did not collapse overnight. Administrators issued statements of regret. Politicians promised investigations and funding. Staff shortages were cited, as they had been at Byberry, at Penhurst, and at countless others. But the footage remained impossible to bury. Rivera's documentary was replayed, referenced, and archived. Each repetition reminded the public of what had been hidden in plain sight. The lawsuits that followed reshaped American law. In 1975, a consent decree required Willowbrook to improve conditions, and by the 1980s, the institution began its slow closure. When the last resident left in 1987, the school's name had already become shorthand for institutional horror. The archival record marks Willowbrook as a turning point, where Byberry had been explained away as an aberration and Penhurst as a failure of resources. Willowbrook was undeniable. The camera's gaze had been too precise, too merciless, and too widely seen. What had once been whispered became indisputable evidence preserved on film. The downfall of Willowbrook revealed not only one institution's cruelty, but the collapse of an entire system's legitimacy. After Rivera's exposé, denial was no longer possible. The camera had turned its lens on a hidden world, and the world could never unsee what it revealed. During the Cold War, paranoia did not stop at borders. It seeped into laboratories, universities, and quietly into America's state hospitals. Among the most chilling intrusions was the CIA's MK-Ultra program, a network of covert experiments designed to test the boundaries of mind control. In institutions already marked by neglect, the vulnerable became subjects not of healing, but of classified science. Creedmoor State Hospital in New York stands as one of the documented sites where these secret trials unfolded. Declassified files confirm that psychiatric patients, many of them children and young adults, were subjected to experiments involving hallucinogenic drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation. In a system where consent was already absent, the CIA found a captive population ideally suited to remain unheard. The methods were brutal in their simplicity. Doses of LSD were administered repeatedly, often without warning, leaving patients disoriented, hallucinating, and unable to distinguish reality from nightmare. Some were confined in isolation chambers for days, deprived of light and sound, their senses distorted until perception itself fractured. Others were guided into hypnotic states, instructed to perform tasks or recall memories under conditions that blurred the line between suggestion and coercion. The rationale was framed in the language of national security. Officials feared that foreign powers were experimenting with psychological control, and so the United States responded in kind. The cost was borne not by volunteers, but by those least able to resist, institutionalized patients whose complaints could be dismissed as delusion, whose families had little access, and whose records could be sealed under the guise of treatment. Archival fragments reveal the clinical coldness with which the experiments were described. Reports spoke of behavioral modification, of subject responses, of failure to adapt. Missing from these pages are the voices of the patients themselves, those who endured weeks of chemical disorientation or who emerged from experiments more broken than before. For them, the asylum's promise of care had been replaced with the state's pursuit of control. The secrecy was nearly perfect. Doctors collaborating with the CIA concealed their work behind the ordinary language of psychiatric care. Doses were recorded as medications, confinement as therapy, hypnosis as routine testing. Administrators signed off on procedures they scarcely understood, reassured that they served the nation's defense. Only decades later, when MK-Ultra files were declassified, did the extent of the intrusion become visible. The image of the state hospital darkens further in this light. It was not merely a place of neglect, but a laboratory where the most vulnerable were treated as expendable. In the same wards where children were once promised education, they were instead turned into experiments, stripped of consent, of protection, and of recognition. Creedmoor was not alone. Other hospitals too became quiet theaters for MK-Ultra's reach. Each experiment was justified in the language of Cold War necessity. Each one left behind patients marked not by healing, but by manipulation. In the end, the CIA's incursion into the asylum system revealed how thin the boundary was between care and control. When secrecy was the foundation, cruelty could wear the mask of science. And in those years, science served not the patient, but the state. The CIA's incursion into America's state hospitals did not scatter its experiments randomly. It followed a grim logic. In the pursuit of mind control, the agency and its collaborators chose subjects not for their suitability, but for their silence. Orphans, children, and psychiatric patients were identified as expendable, lives unlikely to be defended, voices unlikely to be heard. Archival fragments and survivor testimonies reveal a pattern. Children from state-run institutions, already severed from family oversight, were administered powerful hallucinogens under the guise of treatment. Orphans, with no guardians to object, were enrolled in studies that left them disoriented, convulsing, or unresponsive. Adults confined in psychiatric wards, many already labeled as delusional, were dosed repeatedly, their protests dismissed as symptoms of their illness. The cruelty was not hidden in secrecy alone, but in indifference. Researchers noted their subjects clinically, reducing them to numbers on a chart. A child who wept for hours after an injection was described as resistant. A man who became incoherent after days of deprivation was labeled a non-responder. The purpose was not healing, but erasure, the stripping away of memory, identity, and will. Consent, the bedrock of ethical science, was absent by design. The patients chosen were those least capable of refusing, those whose rights had already been surrendered when they were locked behind asylum doors. Administrators cooperated under the belief that experiments served the nation, while doctors justified their actions as contributing to knowledge. The patients themselves were never asked. Some experiments sought to fragment the mind through repeated trauma. High doses of LSD combined with hours of recorded suggestions designed to overwrite memory. Others subjected children to prolonged sensory deprivation, left in isolus. Isolation chambers with no light or sound, their development distorted by forced emptiness. In each case, the assumption was the same, that these lives could be broken apart and studied without consequence. The archival record is chilling in its detachment. Reports speak of improved compliance and notable regression, without reference to the human beings those phrases describe. What emerges is a portrait of science stripped of humanity, where the patient's suffering is noted only insofar as it furthers the experiment. The disposable nature of these subjects lay at the heart of the program. They were not chosen for what they might reveal, but for what they could not resist. In a system already designed to silence them, their exploitation was as invisible as it was inevitable. The CIA needed subjects who would not be missed, and the state hospitals provided them. Decades later, survivors spoke of fragmented memories, weeks lost to chemical haze, names forgotten, and voices that no longer felt their own. Yet for every testimony that survived, countless others ended without record, absorbed into the silence of closed wards and sealed files. The story of these disposable subjects is not one of accident, but of design. Vulnerability was not a flaw in the program. It was its foundation. In the name of science, those least able to defend themselves became the most exploited. For decades, the accounts of survivors sounded too implausible to be believed. They spoke of repeated injections that warped perception, of endless days lost in chemically induced haze, of voices whispered into their ears during states of confusion and terror. Some recalled being locked in isolation chambers, deprived of light until time itself dissolved. Others described memories that felt foreign, implanted, or stolen. Officials dismissed these testimonies as the natural language of mental illness, delusions born from damaged minds. Then came the documents. In the mid-1970s, a series of congressional inquiries unearthed fragments of a program long hidden under layers of secrecy, MK-Ultra. Among the declassified files were memoranda and research reports that confirmed what survivors had been trying to say all along. The experiments had happened, they had been sanctioned, and they had used the most vulnerable patients in state hospitals as their subjects. The language of the documents was clinical, even banal. They spoke of behavioral modification trials, of extended sensory deprivation studies, of LSD dosing schedules. Behind the sterile phrasing, however, lay evidence of human suffering carefully reduced to data points. Pages recorded the administration of hallucinogens to children, the induction of hypnosis under controlled conditions, the erasure of memory through forced trauma. Each file carried the signature of officials who had approved, funded, or concealed these acts in the name of Cold War research. The revelations confirmed what had long been denied, that hospitals like Creedmoor had served as laboratories for experiments too controversial to conduct in the open. Survivors, once dismissed as unreliable, found their voices vindicated, not because the government acknowledged their truth directly, but because the paper trail could no longer be ignored. Yet, even in exposure, concealment remained. Many files had been destroyed in 1973 on the orders of CIA leadership, ensuring that the full scope of MK-Ultra would never be known. What remained were fragments, enough to prove the existence of the program, but insufficient to reveal the complete scale of its abuses. In this partial record, silence persisted, leaving countless questions unanswered. For the survivors, the discovery carried both validation and despair. They had been right all along, but the proof came decades too late. Memories once written off as hallucinations were now recorded in government files, but justice remained elusive. The institutions where the experiments occurred had either closed or denied involvement. The architects of the program retired quietly, their careers untouched by the damage they had overseen. The archival dread lies in the banality of the evidence. The horrors were not hidden in coded language, but spelled out in ordinary bureaucratic terms, as if dosing a child with LSD were no more unusual than prescribing aspirin. The files reduced agony to protocol, turning lives into experiments and suffering into data. In the end, the declassified documents served as both revelation and epitaph. They proved the survivors right, but too late to undo what had been done. The silence that once protected the program had given way to confirmation, but not to accountability. What was buried had been unearthed, but the lives broken in the process remained unrepaired, preserved only in the cold language of the files. For more than a century, the asylum walls held unchallenged authority. To be admitted was to be silenced, and to remain confined was the rule rather than the exception. Families, physicians, and administrators exercised power unchecked while patients lived and died with little hope of release. But in the mid-20th century, after decades of exposure and outrage, the law itself finally entered the wards. In 1975, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision that marked a turning point: O'Connor versus Donaldson. The case concerned Kenneth Donaldson, a man confined in a Florida state hospital for nearly 15 years without meaningful treatment. His only crime had been suffering from delusions. He was not violent, not a danger to others, yet he was held against his will under the justification that he was mentally ill. The court's ruling was historic. It declared that the state had no constitutional right to confine a person indefinitely without treatment, particularly if that person posed no danger to self or others. The opinion cut through centuries of institutional practice, establishing that confinement without care was unlawful. For the first time, the highest court recognized that patients were not simply wards of the state. They were citizens with rights. This ruling did not open the doors of every asylum overnight, but it introduced a new framework. Administrators could no longer justify endless confinement with vague claims of illness. Judges and attorneys now entered conversations once confined to medical boards. The asylum system, long insulated from scrutiny, found itself accountable to constitutional law. At nearly the same time, lawsuits against Pennhurst carried the momentum forward. In 1974, a group of residents filed suit against the state of Pennsylvania, arguing that their treatment at the institution violated their rights under the Constitution. Testimonies of abuse, neglect, and degradation, once dismissed, were now placed before federal courts. The case stretched over years, but its outcome set a precedent. Institutions had a duty to provide humane conditions and education, not merely confinement. The Pennhurst decision forced the courts to acknowledge what investigative journalists and families had long insisted, that the abuse was not incidental but systemic. When the verdict declared Pennhurst unconstitutional in its operations, it established not just a single institution's guilt, but the illegitimacy of a model that relied on neglect. These rulings together signaled a slow dismantling of the asylum's absolute power. Yet the victories were cold in their triumph. They came only after generations had lived and died behind barred windows without recourse. For many patients, the law arrived too late. The institutions that had consumed their lives were already collapsing from within, their ruins left as evidence of what the law had failed to prevent. Still, the legal precedents remain pivotal. They established the principle that mental illness did not erase citizenship, and that confinement without treatment was no longer acceptable under the law. What had once been unquestioned became unconstitutional. The asylum walls, though still standing, were no longer invulnerable. The courts had spoken. Silence was no longer enough to justify confinement. In that recognition, belated though it was, patients won their first fragile claim to freedom. When the last patients were released and the wards locked for the final time, the state hospitals did not disappear. Their walls remained, looming over forgotten landscapes, their size and silence testifying to the scale of what had been hidden within. Across the United States, red brick corridors stretch empty, windows shattered by weather and time, floors layered with dust. The institutions built as monuments of hope now endure as ruins, monuments instead to systemic failure. Deinstitutionalization, launched in waves during the 1960s and accelerated by court rulings and public scandal, closed dozens of hospitals. Yet closure was not erasure. The structures were too vast, too costly to demolish. Instead, they were left to decay, their locked doors slowly yielding to weather, vandals, and urban explorers who carried cameras into the halls where patients once lived unseen. Inside, the remnants remain. Rusted gurneys lean against peeling walls, mattresses collapse in piles, their stuffing scattered by rodents, faded murals, once painted to soothe, peel into abstract fragments. In attics and basements, files lie scattered, pages damp and illegible, names of the forgotten reduced to mold-stained ink. Each room is a record, each object an artifact of lives that were silenced. The silence is not empty. Visitors to the ruins often describe a heaviness, an echo that lingers long after footsteps fade. Long corridors designed for surveillance now seem endless in their vacancy. Wards that once overflowed with bodies now hold only dust and the whisper of drafts through broken glass. The architecture itself testifies. This was a system too large to vanish, too haunted to endure. Urban explorers document what remains. Their photographs circulate online, images of hallways lined with rusting wheelchairs, of medical charts left in filing cabinets, of wards where paint flakes fall leaks. Keash. In their work, the ruins speak again, not with voices of patients, but with the physical residue of their absence. To walk these halls is to confront history preserved in decay. The grounds outside tell the same story. Overgrown lawns once clipped with precision are now choked with vines. Trees push through foundations, reclaiming the landscape. Cemetery plots, many marked only with numbers, lie hidden in the grass, their anonymity a final reminder of how thoroughly the institutions erased individual lives. For some, the ruins invite curiosity, even spectacle, but for others, they stand as warnings. They reveal not just the decay of brick and mortar, but the decay of a system that survived on neglect, silence, and secrecy. Each broken window, each collapsing roof, each abandoned ward is evidence. The past is not buried, it is still standing, waiting to be read. The hospitals were once called temples of healing. Today, their ruins testify to another truth, that what began in hope ended in silence, and that silence still lingers in every crumbling wall. They are not merely abandoned buildings, they are monuments of warning, their emptiness louder than the voices once trapped inside. The record of America's state hospitals is not only one of what occurred inside their walls, but of how long those walls were allowed to stand unchallenged. Neglect persisted not because it was invisible, but because society was willing to look away. The horror lay not solely in the restraints, the hunger, the experiments, but in the silence that surrounded them, the silence of administrators, of legislators, and of the public itself. From Byberry to Penhurst, from Willowbrook to Creedmoor, the pattern repeated. Scandals emerged, outrage followed, promises were made, and then the system resumed, sustained by apathy. Each generation of exposure was treated as if it revealed something new, when in truth it confirmed what had been known for decades. Reports gathered dust. Families' pleas were dismissed. Investigations produced recommendations rather than reforms. The cycle depended not on secrecy alone, but on collective indifference. The ruins that remain today embody this history. Crumbling walls, broken windows, and overgrown cemeteries are more than relics of a failed medical system. They are monuments to forgetting. Each abandoned corridor is evidence of how long suffering can persist when hidden behind institutional doors. The silence of these ruins is heavy, because it mirrors the silence that once protected them. The cost of that silence was measured in human lives. Children who should have known education instead lived bound to beds. Adults who sought help found themselves confined without treatment. Vulnerable patients, already isolated, were turned into subjects of experiments that erased memory and identity. These lives were not lost to accident, but to a structure that relied on concealment, excused by a society that preferred not to see. To forget is to risk repetition. History has shown that secrecy and neglect thrive where oversight is absent, where sufferings can be dismissed as inevitable, where institutions exist to contain rather than to care. The names of Byberry, Penhurst and Willowbrook carry weight today only because they were exposed. Countless other hospitals operated in near anonymity, their stories buried with the patients who never left. The lesson of the state hospitals is not confined to their era. It is a warning that systems built on silence will always breed cruelty, and that justice delayed becomes justice denied. The horror was not only that children suffered, but that they suffered for so long before anyone listened. The institutions collapsed, but the conditions that allowed them to thrive, secrecy, indifference, and the preference for forgetting, remain dangers still. The ruins stand as stark reminders. They do not speak, but they do not need to. Their silence is a testimony louder than words. The cost of forgetting is written in every broken brick, every nameless grave, every lost life. The hospitals are gone, but their warning endures. What is ignored will always return, and silence will always exact its price.